As soon as they teleported back to the desert, the Guardians were immediately on high alert. Their sharp instincts flared to life the moment they arrived and caught sight of Alexander Mondragon standing beneath the towering tree. However, he was not alone. Beside him stood two women, Havana and Zalora. A short distance away, two circular vehicles hovered, suspended in midair. The placement was precise. They had landed at a distance from the tree, close enough to Alexander to see him clearly but far enough to gauge the battlefield. The Guardians instinctively positioned themselves for battle, but Vasper Mondragon's gaze hardened, his sharp eyes fixating on the two women that Alexander Mondragon had brought with him. His lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line as he turned his full attention to Alexander. What was he planning? Why had he brought two women to the desert, when they had no involvement in this war? Without hesitation, Vasper pulled Chanty into his arms, holding her protectively the moment he saw Alexander shift his stance to face them directly. His body was rigid, his grip firm, as if shielding her from something unseen yet deeply foreboding. Alexander's face twisted into a sarcastic smirk as he gazed at them. His expression held nothing but amusement, mocking, belittling. To him, they must have looked like mere playthings, small and insignificant, like tiny ants he could crush in his hands with effortless ease. Chanty, however, remained unwavering. Her eyes, dark and focused, locked onto Alexander, Havana, and Zalora. She stood still, her body tense, refusing to waver under their gaze. Zalora's glare burned into Chanty, eyes seething with pure hatred and jealousy. She was fixated on the way Vasper held Chanty so protectively, shielding her from harm. Her teeth clenched, her jaw tight with barely suppressed rage. But more than that, her lips quivered, her eyes trembled with emotion. The pain in her chest was unbearable, suffocating. She wanted to scream, to unleash the whirlwind of fury and jealousy that clawed at her insides. But she held herself back. No. She refused to let her emotions consume her. She would not display her weakness. No matter how much she burned with anger, no matter how Vasper's betrayal shredded her apart from the inside, she would not break. Not here. Not now. Yet deep within, the fury only grew stronger. The memory of him walking away from her, leaving her behind in the depths of that cave, humiliated her beyond words. He had abandoned her. Insulted her as a woman. Even when she had stripped before him, offering her perfect beauty and body, he had not faltered, had not given in to temptation. The sting of rejection was unlike anything she had ever felt before. But now she had to watch as he held Chanty in his arms, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. It was a wound far deeper than any physical pain. Alexander laughed. A low, mocking chuckle, rich with amusement and condescension. The Guardians, their instincts razor-sharp, spread out in a coordinated movement. 6 warriors, strategically placing themselves around the tree, forming a perimeter, ready to strike at any moment. Alexander's eyes tracked their movements with ease, watching as they encircled him. But he did not move. His body remained still, relaxed. Only his eyes flickered with awareness, and the smirk on his lips never wavered. But that smile. It was anything but friendly. Especially when his gaze landed on Vasper and Chanty. A dark emotion twisted inside Alexander's chest. Jealousy. It clawed at him, unexpected and foreign. He had never felt jealousy before. Not once in his life. Not even when he first arrived on Earth. And yet, here it was. Gnawing at him. Festering like a wound he couldn't ignore. He threw his head back and laughed, louder this time. His laughter echoed through the desert air, his amusement dancing in the wind. And when he looked at Vasper, his sharp gaze meeting his son's, he found nothing but cold detachment. Vasper's expression was unreadable. His eyes, like blades, sliced through Alexander without an ounce of recognition. There was nothing there. No acknowledgement. No warmth. No sign that Vasper saw him as his father. Havana stood silently, watching them both. To her, it felt like she was staring at a single person reflected in a fractured mirror. The resemblance between father and son was undeniable, the sharp features, the effortless dominance, the sheer presence that made women weak in the knees. But there was one stark difference. Their eyes. Their stances. Though they shared the same blood, their souls were cut from entirely different cloth. And as she watched, her gaze softened only to harden again when she saw Vasper holding Chanty so close. Something inside her twisted. A pang. A sting. Jealousy. For the first time, she saw Vasper in a way she had never seen before. The way he held Chanty, the way he protected her. It was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. There was care in his eyes. Possessiveness. Devotion. A depth of emotion she had never once seen in his past relationships. Not even with Zalora. Even though Havana and Vasper's relationship had been a secret in the past, she could never forget him, especially in bed. If Vasper Mondragon had any expertise beyond his deadly adventures, it was in bringing pleasure to women. That had been his life in the past, back in the inner world, where he counted women like trophies, choosing without discrimination, as long as they were beautiful and caught his interest. Havana knew all about Vasper's escapades with women, yet she kept it hidden from Zalora. Havana glanced at Zalora. Her eyes burned as she stared at Chanty and Vasper, her body trembling, undoubtedly with jealousy and rage. But what unsettled Havana the most was Alexander's expression as he watched Vasper and Chanty. She knew Alexander carried a wound on his side, still unhealed. Only Chanty's blood could mend it. But within mere hours, his full power would return. And when that moment arrived, he would need to take Chanty's blood to extend his life and strengthen his abilities in the inner world. Alexander's smile mirrored Vasper's, deadly, serious. Their gazes locked, exchanging silent words, their eyes alone capable of delivering lethal messages. Chanty stared at Vasper's face, unable to move under the force of his protective embrace. "Vasper, I can't move," she whispered, her voice meant only for his ears, but loud enough for the guardians and Alexander, those with supernatural hearing, to catch. Jacob observed Chanty, Vasper, and Alexander carefully. For now, he let Vasper do as he pleased. After all, they were both there for the same reason, to protect and stand beside Chanty in her fight against Alexander Mondragon. Yet, Jacob could not deny the pain in his chest as he watched Chanty and Vasper together. His feelings for Chanty had never faded. They remained buried within him, suppressed out of respect, out of deference to her relationship with Jake Valerian, whom he had considered a brother. But now, Jake was gone, dead. Jacob's heart blazed with fury toward Vasper Mondragon. He despised the idea of Chanty being with Vasper. He was certain she would only suffer at his hands. Vasper had too many women. Even though Jacob had witnessed some change in Vasper ever since Chanty entered his life, he still wasn't convinced that Vasper could truly change, especially when it came to women. Jacob loved Chanty. More than anything, he wanted to see her happy and far from harm. Meanwhile, David struggled to suppress his own feelings for Zalora. He pitied her, seeing the burning rage and seething jealousy in her eyes as she glared at Chanty and Vasper. David had harbored feelings for Zalora since the first time he met her, back when he became a guardian. But at that time, she was in a relationship with Vasper. He had witnessed how happy she was with Vasper, how she took pride in their bond. But now, things were drastically different. David took a deep, heavy breath, his gaze fixed on Zalora, though his expression of longing did not go unnoticed by Gabriel. Gabriel flicked his gaze between David and Zalora but chose to ignore the silent tension between them. Then, without warning, everyone was on high alert. In a split second, Alexander vanished from where he had been standing, and reappeared directly behind Chanty, who was still being held protectively by Vasper. The guardians rushed forward, aiming to intercept, but they were abruptly suspended midair, left floating, unable to advance. Zalora and Havana's expressions flashed with shock. But unlike Zalora, Havana quickly regained her composure. She had witnessed too many of Alexander's tricks to be surprised. Instead, she stood there, smirking in satisfaction as she watched the chaos unfold before her. The real spectacle, however, was the deadly battle of wills happening between Vasper and Alexander. Their locked gazes burned with an intensity that could kill. Vasper poured every ounce of his power into maintaining an invisible shield, a desperate barrier between Chanty and Alexander. But the force of Alexander's magic grew stronger with every second, steadily breaking through. Chanty, held tightly in Vasper's arms, felt the tension in his body, the strain in his muscles, the deep-set focus in his eyes, the sheer effort it took just to keep them safe. She looked up at him, concern evident in her gaze. "Vasper, let me face him," she whispered, her voice meant only for his ears, but heard by the Guardians and Alexander due to their heightened senses. "I am the only one who can defeat him. No one else can." Vasper's eyes, filled with worry, courage, and something softer, something almost tender, met Chanty's determined gaze. He didn't want to let her go. He wanted to protect her. But her unwavering expression told him she had already made her decision. Alexander smiled. A cold, deadly smirk. "My son," he said, his voice laced with eerie amusement. "Zalora is waiting for you. Hand Chanty over to me. You already knew from the beginning, she was always meant for me, wasn't she? Give her to me while I am still in a generous mood. Do not make me lose my patience." His voice was quiet, yet thick with menace. A warning. A promise of destruction. Vasper's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding in frustration. Then, without warning, Louis broke free from Alexander's telekinetic grip. He lunged at Alexander from behind, catching him off guard. Alexander barely had time to react. He had underestimated Louis. The impact sent Alexander flying several feet away, the force knocking the Guardians free from their suspended state. Havana and Zalora gasped at the sudden turn of events. But even as Havana looked toward Alexander, Zalora's gaze remained locked on Vasper. Alexander, unshaken, immediately teleported back to Chanty's side. But before he could strike, Vasper, moving in a blur, teleported away with Chanty just in time. Alexander, still smirking, nearly turned his head and followed them with his gaze. Then, Louis made another move, raising his diamond bullet gun and charging toward Alexander once more. But in a blink, Alexander grabbed him, twisting his arm behind his back with brutal efficiency. The diamond gun was kicked out of Louis's grip and sent flying into the air. Before it could hit the ground, Jacob caught it in a lightning-fast motion, cocked it, and fired at Alexander in one seamless move. The bullet grazed Alexander's shoulder. If he had been an ordinary man, there would have been no escape. But Alexander dodged just in time, the bullet only slicing through fabric and skin. David seized the opportunity. Summoning a violent whirlwind of smoke and desert sand, he trapped Alexander inside. The storm raged around them, forming an impenetrable prison. Alexander's teleportation magic was useless within the swirling chaos. But there was a cost. David knew he could only sustain the storm for a few minutes before he ran out of oxygen himself. This ability, his deadliest weapon, was meant to imprison enemies or protect allies. But now, he was using it for one purpose alone, to restrain Alexander Mondragon and hold him long enough to strike a finishing blow. He wasted no time. Charging into the storm, David launched himself at Alexander, and the two clashed violently inside the suffocating whirlwind. Outside the storm, the Guardians stood tense, watching anxiously. They knew David shouldn't be in there. He was risking his life for even the smallest chance to take down Alexander. They couldn't afford to lose him. But the battle had begun. Chanty and Vasper stood at a distance, their eyes glowing as they watched intently. A memory surfaced in Chanty's mind. The whirlwind that now raged before her was the same force that had once surrounded her. Back then, their mansion had been attacked by a great eagle, and the resulting fire had claimed the lives of her father and his attending doctor. She recalled how she had been trapped within the whirlwind, suffocating until she lost consciousness. Fear gripped her heart as she suddenly cried out, calling David's name. But Vasper had no intention of letting her go. His arms remained firmly wrapped around her, his lips pressed tightly together. He knew exactly what David was planning, but even if Alexander couldn't escape David's whirlwind, he doubted that David could actually inflict any damage on him. However, Vasper still held on to a sliver of hope. If even one among them could wound Alexander, it would be enough to create an opening for Chanty. That opening could allow her to strike at Alexander's heart with the sword of destiny. Yet, even if the 7 most powerful men stood together, they were nothing compared to Alexander Mondragon's thousands of years of battle experience. He wouldn't have earned a place in the book of legends if he weren't truly formidable. It was evident. They needed the sword of destiny, for only that weapon could be wielded against the immortals like Alexander. For ordinary people or lesser beings, the Guardians were already overwhelmingly powerful, and Vasper Mondragon himself was no exception. However, even they were nowhere near half the strength of Alexander. Compared to his ancient existence, they were like newborn children before a being who had lived for countless ages. Alexander Mondragon, the last true immortal who walked the earth. And now, the time had come to end him. His influence over both the outer world and inner world had to be severed. As this was the dream of many. Every ruler seated upon their thrones longed for Alexander Mondragon's destruction, hoping to claim his kingdom and the lands he ruled. Those lands were teeming with wealth, the home of the mighty dragons. Even if the treasures of the outer world and inner world were combined, they would still pale in comparison to the riches hidden within Alexander's domain. The land of Velantis Noctem. This territory was overflowing with precious stones, minerals, and rare resources that were worth an unimaginable fortune. And among all these riches, the mighty dragons were the most valuable of all. Dragons had many uses, especially when tamed and trained. They could serve in various roles within the inner world, be used in wars, or even become guardians of fortified lands. Everyone feared and respected dragons, for they were the only species in the inner world that commanded such reverence. Every kingdom desired to have more dragons within their domain, as these creatures were not just counted as weapons of power but also as prized assets. This was why Alexander Mondragon's dominion was envied by all. His territory held the largest dragon nesting ground. The Dragon's Mountain. A place where dragons laid their eggs. There was no other location they favored more than this, as it was close to volcanic craters. Not just any ordinary volcano, but a unique one with 3 peaks. This mountain was also rich in precious stones, crystals, and minerals, making it even more desirable. And Alexander alone controlled these resources. His wealth and power had long fueled the jealousy of rulers from every kingdom in the inner world, all of whom wished for his demise. Not only was he the last true immortal left on earth, but his name had been engraved in the inner world's legends for centuries. Yet, despite his immense power, Alexander could never leave Velantis Noctem. A powerful curse bound him. Should he ever step beyond his kingdom's borders, his powers would vanish, leaving him nothing more than a mere mortal until death claimed him. Because of this, not once had Alexander ever left his domain. Many had tried to lure him out of Velantis Noctem, but none had ever succeeded. His enemies could never even lay a hand on him, for Alexander could simply will it so. Meanwhile, Chanty trembled as she watched in horror. Inside the whirlwind, all they could see were swirling sands and jagged stones, violently spinning within the raging storm. At the center of it all, a crimson lightning flashed, illuminating the chaos within. "Vasper! Let me go!" Chanty cried out, struggling against his grip. "I need to fight Alexander. I can take him on. His power will return in just a few more hours. I have to strike now while I still have the chance." She pushed against Vasper's embrace, desperate to break free. But he refused to let her go. He stared into her eyes, understanding her determination, but his heart was still weighed down by deep concern. "I know," Vasper said, his voice firm. "But it will be a great help if we can slow down his movements so you can find an opening and strike him straight in the chest. Whatever you do, don't let him catch you. If he does, he'll be able to drain your blood again. He still has a wound on his side. The moment he gets out of David's whirlwind, we will attack him first. Your job is to make sure you land the finishing blow." Vasper's determination was evident in his tone, and he made sure Chanty understood exactly what needed to be done. Alexander Mondragon had to be finished. Chanty nodded. She understood. More than that, she was determined to end this battle once and for all. To avenge Jake's death and the loss of her parents. But Vasper's attention suddenly shifted to where Havana and Zalora stood. He had just noticed Zalora stepping toward them. Chanty, sensing the change, also turned alertly toward Zalora. The woman's expression wasn't friendly. Chanty had already accepted the fact that Zalora saw her the same way as all the other women from Vasper Mondragon's past. Zalora quickly approached them, her movements sharp and purposeful, while Havana trailed behind her, watching closely. Havana's expression was serious, filled with curiosity. Not about Alexander and David inside the whirlwind, but rather about Vasper and Zalora. However, before Zalora could reach them, Vasper teleported, disappearing to a different location, far away from both Zalora and Havana. Zalora clenched her fists in fury, her whole body trembling with anger as she stood frozen in place. She turned her gaze toward where Vasper and Chanty had been standing just moments ago. But they were gone. Frustrated, Zalora let out a furious scream. "Coward!" she yelled into the air, not holding back her voice. Her outburst immediately drew the attention of the other guardians, who looked at her in confusion. They hadn't seen what had happened and were wondering why she was suddenly shouting. Jacob's eyes scanned the battlefield, searching for Vasper. He found him, at a distance, focused on the battle between David and Alexander. And then, in an instant, the whirlwind vanished. The sand and rocks that had been violently swirling around suddenly collapsed, falling back to the desert floor. The wind died down, and the battlefield cleared. Their eyes widened. David lay unconscious in the sand. He was motionless, drained of energy. But beside him, Alexander Mondragon was also down. David had managed to wound Alexander. The injury on Alexander's side, the one caused by Chanty, had been targeted by David. Blood stained Alexander's clothes. His shirt and pants soaked in red. His body curled in pain, his hand clutching his side while the other pressed against the sand as he struggled to move away from David. His breathing was ragged. His face twisted in pain, and blood dripped from his wound. The guardians wasted no time. They attacked immediately. Justin rushed toward David, lifting him from the battlefield. Meanwhile, four guardians surrounded Alexander, preparing to finish him off. Zalora and Havana's eyes burned with intensity as they watched the battle unfold. But with all the swirling dust and debris, they could barely make out what was happening. They couldn't tell who had the upper hand anymore. And then, suddenly, the bodies of the guardians were flung into the air. One by one, they were hurled backward, scattered across the battlefield like rag dolls. The only one left standing was Jacob. His body now glowed with a brilliant blue aura. His clothes were tattered and torn, his muscles exposed, and his entire body covered in sand and sweat. His face was deadly serious, filled with nothing but rage and the thirst for blood. Jacob launched himself at Alexander. Blazing fists rained down upon him, striking his body and face repeatedly, each punch aimed at his already wounded side. Everyone around them watched with wide eyes as the battle intensified. The air burned with power, now glowing in eerie blue. Alexander, however, laughed. Even as Jacob's relentless attacks landed one after another, even though he was clearly in pain, Alexander laughed loudly, as if none of it mattered. Jacob's fury exploded. He caught Alexander by the throat, his grip tightening. With a furious roar, he delivered a devastating punch straight to Alexander's chest. A shockwave erupted. Jacob was aiming directly for Alexander's heart, attempting to stop its beat completely. His fist burned with power, and with a savage battle cry, he unleashed a barrage of fiery punches, so fast that no ordinary eye could follow. Zalora and Havana could only gape in disbelief. Even they, strong warriors in their own right, could not track Jacob's movements. Havana's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, she felt a deep unease for Alexander. She had always known David was strong. After all, he was the only guardian she had ever met in person. But this man fighting Alexander now, he was on a completely different level. Her respect for him grew. Tension filled the battlefield. Zalora stood rigid beside Havana, her eyes locked on the battle. The air around them crackled with energy. This was no ordinary fight. This was a battle where only one could walk away alive. As Jacob delivered his final punch, the battlefield fell into silence. The wind stilled, and the results of the battle became clear. A massive crater marked the spot where Jacob and Alexander had fought. Jacob sat atop Alexander's chest, his hand gripping Alexander's throat while his clenched fist pressed firmly against his enemy's heart. Sweat dripped from Jacob's face and body, his muscles fully exposed. His breath heavy as he stared down at Alexander. Jacob's eyes burned with fury. Alexander's eyes were shut. His body motionless, breathless. Was he truly dead? Jacob couldn't tell. Havana, unable to contain herself, suddenly whispered, "Wow, he's hot, right? Look at him." She turned to Zalora, who furrowed her brows in confusion, staring at Havana. After everything that had just happened, with Alexander lying seemingly lifeless beneath Jacob, was this really what Havana, Alexander Mondragon's mistress, had to say? That Jacob was hot? Zalora couldn't believe it, but she chose to remain silent. The guardians who had been watching from a distance, still recovering from the intense battle, held their breath as they observed the scene unfold. They hoped, prayed, that Jacob had finally finished Alexander for good. But then, something shocking happened. Vasper and Chanty suddenly appeared within the crater where Jacob sat. Their arrival was so swift that those watching could only see a blur before they registered their presence. In an instant, Vasper shoved Jacob away without warning, sending him flying. "Get back, Jacob!" Vasper screamed and turned to Chanty. "Finish him now, Chanty!" Vasper shouted. But instead of responding immediately, Jacob looked toward Chanty. Without hesitation, Chanty summoned the Sword of Destiny into her hands. The blade gleamed as she raised it, preparing to drive it into Alexander's chest. Alexander lay there, still and covered in blood, seemingly lifeless. But just as Chanty was about to strike, Alexander's eyes snapped open, locking directly onto hers. Chanty froze. The intensity in his gaze sent a shiver down her spine. She was moments away from ending his life. Yet before she could react, Alexander moved. Faster than anyone could comprehend, Alexander snatched Chanty and vanished from sight. In mere seconds, both he and Chanty were gone. The guardians and Vasper stood in stunned silence, their eyes darting around in search of them. None of them had seen how it happened. Alexander had outmaneuvered them completely. David and Jacob roared in frustration, their eyes burning with anger as they turned to Vasper. But they couldn't blame him. Vasper had believed, like the rest of them, that Alexander was truly finished. It had been the perfect opportunity for Chanty to strike at his heart. Jacob, furious, slammed his fists into the sand, screaming. He had given everything he had to bring Alexander down. But the vampire had merely pretended to be dead. Vasper, his own body trembling with rage, kicked at the sand repeatedly, his voice filled with frustration as he shouted. Havana and Zalora, meanwhile, couldn't help but laugh as they watched the guardians struggle. Even they hadn't anticipated this outcome. And then, out of nowhere, 7 men were suddenly lifted into the air, their bodies hovering like statues, controlled by Alexander's telekinesis. Despite their combined strength, none of them could resist his power. Not even Lewis, who also wielded telekinesis. Alexander's ability was far superior. Laughter erupted from Alexander as he slowly approached the guardians. Behind him, Chanty stood, free but unmoving, watching as Alexander manipulated the 7 men effortlessly. "Face me, Alexander. Not them. Are you a coward?" Chanty's voice rang out, trembling with fury. Her entire body shook with anger. Alexander stood tall, his long red hair flowing behind him like blazing fire, exuding raw power. He smiled at Chanty, lowering his hands slightly. But the 7 men remained suspended in the air. "Who shall follow Jake Valerian?" Alexander asked with a smirk. His question wasn't just taunting. It was filled with amusement, as if he relished the flames of fury burning inside Chanty. He wanted her. Her blood, which would grant him immortality. And her body, which would bring him pleasure. And he wanted the sword of destiny to completely vanish from Chanty's body. He wanted to claim her completely, to make her his queen. Chanty's eyes blazed with hatred. Fear gnawed at her as she realized she didn't know what Alexander would do next. Then, suddenly, a lightning bow and arrow materialized in Alexander's hand. He aimed it directly at Vasper Mondragon. His own son, his traitor. No. Two voices screamed at once. Chanty and Zalora. Alexander turned his gaze towards Zalora, amusement flickering in his eyes before shifting back to Chanty. But when he looked at Chanty, his expression changed. His eyes darkened with jealousy and possessiveness. Fine. Not Vasper. He smirked. Zalora is waiting for him, after all. Don Lorenzo. You belong to me. Vasper belongs to Zalora, doesn't he? Alexander's words sent a chill through Chanty. She trembled, her body shaking with silent tears. Her eyes burned with rage, making her beauty even more mesmerizing in Alexander's eyes. Havana, entertained, listened closely to Zalora's muttering. Though Zalora spoke softly, they all knew Alexander could hear her. Not your son, my king. He's mine. Please. He's mine. Zalora's desperate whispers repeated over and over, her words sending chills down Havana's spine. A sly smile played on Havana's lips as she watched Zalora. She knew Zalora was obsessed with Vasper. But it was no surprise. After all, she herself had many times tasted Vasper in bed, and that experience was something she would never forget. Even in secret, Havana longed to relive it. And just as Alexander was about to release his arrow, he changed his mind. With a sudden movement, he redirected his aim. The arrow was now pointed at David's chest. Even from afar, Chanty knew exactly where the arrow was aimed. Tears streamed down her face as she screamed. No. Please let them go. Don't involve them in this fight, Alexander. Her voice was raw with desperation. And in that moment, Vasper broke free from Alexander's grip. Suddenly, Vasper teleported to Chanty and Alexander's location. However, the moment he arrived, he could no longer move. He was once again trapped in Alexander's telekinetic grip. Alexander laughed wickedly. Yes. Indeed, he's my son. I'm so proud of him. Alexander declared, his voice echoing with pride. My blood runs through his veins. His gaze locked onto Vasper's face, which remained stern. Chanty, on the other hand, stared at Vasper with tears streaming down her face. She wanted to run to him, to reach out and touch him. But he was too close to Alexander. So she stood frozen in place, unable to move. Without another word, Chanty suddenly lunged at Alexander. But the moment she reached him, her strike hit nothing but air. Alexander had vanished. Her eyes darted forward, and there he was, appearing once again. This time, he was already drawing his bow, aiming it at David. Just as he was about to release the arrow, Chanty screamed, "No. Please. No." Over and over again. She fell to her knees in the sand, pleading desperately with Alexander, tears falling from her eyes. She couldn't bear to lose David, he had become like family to her. Just like all the other guardians. Above them, the guardians were still floating in the air, held captive by Alexander's power. Vasper, too, remained suspended beside them. Alexander, watching Chanty cry, smiled, a twisted, amused grin. If you stop resisting, none of your friends have to die, my queen. Alexander said, his tone dripping with mockery. His eyes gleamed with admiration and amusement, his heart pounding with excitement. Havana, standing in the background, seethed with jealousy. Not once had Alexander ever called her my queen. Even when she was the one he had chosen to replace Vasper's mother, she had never heard him speak with such a tone. Soft yet commanding. Possessive yet adoring. It burned her to see Chanty in that position. She could not accept that Chanty would become the queen of Velantis. She shot a glare at Alexander and Chanty, her lips pressed tightly together. Zalora, standing nearby, noticed Havana's reaction but remained silent. To Zalora, the only thing that mattered was Vasper Mondragon. She didn't care if Chanty became queen of Velantis as long as Vasper did not end up with Chanty. Vasper belonged to her alone. Meanwhile, Chanty sat in the sand, her fingers clenching into the grains as tears dripped onto them. She bit down on her lower lip, ignoring the pain from the wound Alexander had inflicted earlier. The sting was nothing compared to the agony she felt inside. Alexander spoke again, but this time, his voice was softer, more coaxing. My queen. There's no need to fight me anymore. Surrender yourself to me, and I will release your friends. I will even take Vasper with us to Velantis. I promise to grant your every desire. His words drifted through the air like a gentle breeze at dawn. Deceptively soothing. Almost hypnotic. But they made Chanty's skin crawl. A wave of disgust coursed through her veins. And yet, she slowly rose to her feet. Her body felt weak, drained of all strength. Her sobs had quieted, and she turned to look at David. Alexander watched her closely, a smirk forming as he lowered his bow. The weapon disappeared from his hands. Chanty turned back to face him, but something had changed. Her eyes were now glowing red. Without hesitation, she lunged at Alexander. But Alexander was quick. In an instant, he teleported away to a safe distance. Without wasting another second, he aimed his bow at David and let the arrow fly. It struck David's thigh. At the same time, Jacob and Lewis were also hit in their legs. Chanty gasped as she watched the three men bleed, their crimson lifeblood staining the desert sand. They could not move. Their faces twisted in pain. But they remained paralyzed, trapped in Alexander's telekinetic hold. Something inside Chanty snapped. She looked down at her hands, her sword. The sword of destiny had vanished from her grasp. A scream tore from her throat. No. She lifted her hand just as Alexander took aim once more. This time, his arrow was aimed directly at David's heart. Tears blurred her vision as she sobbed. No. I'm sorry. Please, no. I'll do it. I'll surrender. Please. Her voice cracked with desperation as she gazed at the three men, their blood pooling around their feet. She knew they were in pain, but they could do nothing to fight back under Alexander's power. Alexander threw his head back and laughed. Enough, my queen. No more tricks. No more resistance. He said smugly. If you surrender willingly, no one will have regrets in the end. Otherwise, your beloved guardians will die here and now. He grinned. They can live in the outer world, but not in mine. They can complete their missions in the inner world, but never against me. They are nothing compared to my power. They are mere children compared to the thousands of years I have ruled. His arrogance was infuriating, but there was truth in his words. Chanty's body trembled. Her spirit, once fiery and defiant, seemed to crumble. The look in her eyes told everyone what they needed to know. She had surrendered. Alexander stepped forward and seized her hand. Behind them, Havana and Zalora watched, their eyes burning with jealousy. This was not how it was supposed to be. This was not how it was supposed to end. Vasper's fingers twitched as he slowly began to move. He was almost free from Alexander's grip. But before he could break free, Alexander noticed him and doubled the power restraining him. Don't bother trying, son. Alexander said, his voice cold and absolute. No matter what you do, you are powerless against me. She belongs to me, not to you. With that, he stepped closer to Chanty. Without hesitation, He captured her lips once more, greedily drawing in her breath and drinking her blood, siphoning her essence to heal the wound on his side. The moment his lips met hers, the gash on his ribs sealed itself, the torn flesh mending as if it had never been wounded. Chanty went completely still, unable to move. Havana's jealousy burned even hotter as she watched the scene unfold. Vasper, though paralyzed, could see and hear everything. His blood boiled with rage, but his body remained locked in place. Zalora, standing nearby, smirked as she watched Alexander kiss Chanty. She wanted Vasper to witness it. She wanted him to see everything and feel the pain of helplessness. She knew exactly what she was doing. But her gaze also flickered toward the three guardians, David, Jacob, and Louis, who were still pinned down by Alexander's lightning arrows. Their wounds continued to bleed into the sand, staining it red. Vasper clenched his jaw, his entire being consumed by the desperate need to break free. He fought with all his strength against his father's power. Little by little, he began to move. "Chanty, move!" Vasper shouted, his voice raw with urgency. He knew she was already under the spell of Alexander's hypnotic breath, one of his father's deadly abilities. Vasper managed to move his head, but the rest of his body remained locked in place, as if encased in stone. "Chanty, move!" He screamed again. But before he could say more, Alexander silenced him, tightening his telekinetic grip and doubling its strength once more. However, something changed. Chanty heard Vasper's voice. Slowly, as if moving through thick fog, her right hand began to rise. Her fingers twitched, inching their way up Alexander's body. He didn't notice. His entire focus was on consuming her essence, lost in the ecstasy of her blood and breath. He moaned in satisfaction, savoring the taste of her lips. The sweetness was unlike anything he had ever experienced. She was intoxicating. His mind was already made up. He would take her to his palace. He could feel it now. His power was almost fully restored. The inner sun was close to returning to its rightful position, and the 9-hour window of the twilight reckoning was nearing its end. It was time. It was time for his ritual. Tonight, he would claim immortality by drinking Chanty's blood. Of course. He wouldn't drain her completely. He would leave just enough to keep her alive. After all, she was to be his queen. He smirked against her lips, still tasting the remnants of her blood. "Let's go, my queen. Let's go home, to our kingdom." He held her tightly, ready to take her back to Velantis Noctem Palace. His dominion, his empire. But then, a sudden, violent impact. Alexander's body jerked, his breath hitching in his throat. A burst of energy exploded from his chest. The sword of destiny had pierced straight through his heart. His crimson eyes widened in shock. Havana and Zalora's eyes burned with rage. Havana screamed, her voice laced with horror, as she rushed toward Alexander, who now stood impaled by the legendary blade. At the same time, the 6 guardians, David, Jacob, Louis, and the others, fell from Alexander's grasp, crashing onto the ground, finally free. Though injured from the arrow in his leg, Louis reacted instantly. He intercepted Havana, using his telekinetic hold to suspend her in midair before she could reach Alexander. David and Jacob clutched their wounded legs, groaning from the pain, but their focus remained on healing themselves. The enchanted arrows embedded in their flesh began to dissolve into black smoke, dissipating into the wind. They all stared at Chanty, who stood firm, gripping the sword of destiny, the very blade that was now buried deep in Alexander's heart. And then, without hesitation, she drove it even deeper. Beside her, Vasper stood rigid, his jaw clenched, fists tightly balled at his sides. His eyes burned as he watched Alexander's face. His father, whose eyes glowed with unspoken fury but whose mouth could no longer form words. Blood seeped from Alexander's lips, trickling down his chin and neck. It was the same sight she had witnessed with Jake. Chanty's expression was twisted in pure, unfiltered rage, yet a triumphant smile curled at the edges of her lips. A smile laced with vengeance and satisfaction. Alexander's body slowly began to sink to the ground, and Chanty followed, lowering herself with him. Her gaze never left his as his breaths grew shallow, counted only in painful gasps. "For Jake," Chanty hissed through gritted teeth. She twisted the blade. Alexander's body convulsed violently, blood spraying from the wound. His arms, once powerful, now lay limp at his sides. Yet in his eyes, there was still resistance, an unrelenting refusal to surrender to death. "And for my parents," Chanty screamed. She twisted the sword again. Alexander exhaled one final breath, his mouth barely parting. Then his eyes shut. At that very moment, the sky shifted. The sun's light dimmed, shadows stretching unnaturally. The world darkened into a dusky twilight, as if the day itself mourned. Slowly, the eternal dusk of Velantis reclaimed its hold, locking the kingdom in its usual state of never-ending twilight. Chanty collapsed onto the sand, her fingers finally releasing the sword of destiny, which remained embedded in Alexander Mondragon's lifeless chest. His body lay sprawled in the desert, surrounded by the eerie glow of the fading sun. It was over. Tears streamed down Chanty's face, tears not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief. She looked at the sword of destiny, feeling deep within her that Jake would be proud. That her parents would be proud. And then, arms wrapped around her from behind, embracing her tightly. It was Vasper Mondragon. "You did it. You did it," he whispered repeatedly into her ear. Chanty's breath hitched as she turned to see the 6 guardians surrounding them. Dust, sweat, and blood stained their bodies, but their eyes were filled with emotion. David, his legs still covered in blood, suddenly dropped to his knees before her. Overcome with guilt, Chanty immediately threw her arms around him. "I'm sorry, David. It's my fault you got shot in the leg. I'm so sorry," she sobbed, holding on to him tightly. David, however, only smiled. Vasper, kneeling behind them, narrowed his eyes at David. Jealous fool, David thought, catching the sharp glare. "It's okay, Chanty," David reassured her, gently pulling away. Mainly because he could feel Vasper's deadly gaze boring into him. "Our wounds have already healed. We understand why you did what you did." Marco, one of the guardians, smirked, exchanging glances with the others as they all noticed Vasper's growing irritation. Just like Jake, Marco thought in amusement. Jacob remained silent, merely observing. Chanty finally stood, so does Vasper, and he instinctively wrapped an arm around her waist. The guardian's eyes flickered to Vasper's hand resting possessively on her hip, and Chanty immediately flushed with embarrassment. Before anyone could comment, a loud, angry voice cut through the air. "See you at the council meeting, Vasper Mondragon." "Zalora," she shouted from a distance before boarding her vehicle, her voice sharp with warning. Vasper barely acknowledged her, his attention already shifting back to Alexander's corpse. But then, Alexander's body began to disintegrate. Like grains of sand, his flesh crumbled, dissolving into the desert. Chanty gasped, recognizing the eerie resemblance to the prophecy of the Sword of Destiny. David and the other guardians didn't seem surprised. Neither did Vasper. They all knew why this was happening. David turned toward Lewis and nodded. Without needing further instruction, Lewis approached Havana, who was still seething with rage. Understanding what had to be done, Lewis used his telekinetic hold to lift her into her own vehicle before slamming the door shut. Havana thrashed inside, pounding furiously against the windows. Without hesitation, Lewis flung the vehicle far away, sending it hurtling across the desert. And just like that, she was gone. Only the guardians, Vasper, and Chanty remained. All of them stared at what little was left of Alexander Mondragon, only his garments and shoes remained in the sand. Vasper stepped forward, retrieving the fallen clothing. They would take it back to Velantis as proof. Proof that the king of Velantis Noctem was dead. And then, Vasper turned to Chanty. His eyes were full of love, full of excitement. He knew what was coming next. He had seen it in the prophecy. He had seen it in the vision of the golden bed. And when Chanty met his gaze, she understood. Her breath hitched, and she quickly averted her eyes. But the guardians had already noticed everything. Jacob, in particular, was seething. His glare toward Vasper was nothing short of murderous. Vasper, however, paid him no mind. He was far more eager to see the next part of the prophecy unfold. "Let's go," he murmured, leaning close to Chanty's ear. "We'll head to my home first. I'll take you back to Sylvan Concord tomorrow." His voice was gentle, intimate. But the guardians heard him. And David was the first to speak. "Vasper, Chanty needs to report to the war tent immediately," David said firmly. "The allied kingdoms surrounding our camp need to know what happened. If we don't inform them soon, it could lead to war." His voice left no room for argument. Vasper met his gaze in a silent battle of wills. Jacob immediately moved behind David, reinforcing his stance. His glare bore into Vasper, sharp as a blade. Vasper smirked. He would let them win this one. For now. The tension in the surroundings began to rise, and Chanty could no longer endure it as she looked at David. She turned to Vasper, facing him directly, ensuring that he could not refuse. She gazed at him with eyes full of gentleness, pleading, persuading. "Please, Vasper, let me finish my duties until everything is done," Chanty said, locking her gaze onto his, knowing he could never deny her request. At that moment, despite everything that had happened, Vasper did not want to be apart from Chanty, but he had no choice. Chanty herself was asking him, he could never refuse her plea. He let out a deep sigh, looking at Chanty, then at David, and then at the faces of the other guardians, all waiting for his decision, all depending on him to take them back to the tent through teleportation. "Fine," Vasper finally said, though the words weighed heavily on him, and it was clear they did not come from the heart. Chanty smiled, but the smile never reached her eyes. "David, take Chanty to the golden bath immediately so her wounds can heal," Vasper instructed, his touch filled with care as he caressed her lips, swollen from Alexander Mondragon's vicious bite. David simply nodded. He knew that the golden bath would be Chanty's first destination. She needed to recover from the unbearable exhaustion weighing down her body. Vasper pulled Chanty into a tight embrace. "I love you so much, babe, and I miss you," he whispered softly against her ear. The guardians couldn't take it anymore. They laughed bitterly and turned away, including David. They couldn't bear to watch Vasper's affectionate display toward Chanty, it made them cringe. But for Jacob, it wasn't just cringe, it was jealousy. Vasper shot the guardians a quick glance as they turned their backs. He didn't care about what they thought. "Can we go home now?" Jacob said, making it obvious that he was eager to return to the tent. Chanty, feeling embarrassed, turned toward David, but he and the others had already looked away, as if they were ashamed to watch. Vasper pulled Chanty's body back, holding onto her tightly while gripping Alexander Mondragon's robe with one hand. "Let's go home," he said. The guardians stepped closer behind Vasper, their eyes fixed on the sand, while Jacob stared at David, hesitating to place his hand on Vasper's body. Vasper, in turn, simply met Jacob's gaze, silent, intense, a challenge. Jacob, however, merely returned the stare with the same intensity. Then suddenly, their surroundings shifted. They were back in the tent. The entire encampment was immediately on high alert upon their arrival, as everyone had been waiting for news. Lauren stood at a distance, her sharp gaze fixed on Chanty. Chanty instinctively avoided Lauren's eyes, feeling the weight of unspoken accusations. "Let's go home," David simply told the general, who had been waiting for his command. Elven and hybrid soldiers erupted in celebration. They cheered, leaping with joy. There would be no war. They could finally return to their families, safe and in peace. But Chanty, she was the only one who wasn't happy. Jake was gone. She never wanted Jake to die. She feared this would happen, yet it did. Because of his stubbornness. Because of the path he chose for himself. Then suddenly, silence fell. Vasper had pulled Chanty into his arms again, and tears had begun to fall from her eyes. Immediately, the soldiers left the tent, giving them space. David then gave the general orders to spread the news, so that preparations could begin for their return to Sylvan Concord. The general also began preparations for the tribute ceremony to honor Jake Valerian's death when they arrived in Sylvan Concord. But just as Lauren spoke, the entire camp fell silent. All eyes turned to Lauren. "Stop with the dramatics, Don Lorenzo." Lauren's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You're crying over Jake's death, but the truth is, you're happy. Happy that nothing stands in the way of your relationship with Vasper Mondragon." Lauren's voice was filled with pure rage, it overflowed. The guardians stood frozen, mouths slightly agape. They knew Chanty's grief was real. They knew how much she mourned Jake. Chanty pulled away from Vasper's embrace and faced Lauren head-on. Their eyes locked, both sharp, both unyielding. Chanty's tears continued to fall. Vasper watched Lauren, irritation flickering in his gaze. "I loved Jake, Lauren. And his death hurts me. I never wanted him to die." Chanty spat through gritted teeth, her fists clenched tightly. But Lauren only laughed, a bitter, cruel laugh. "Hypocrite!" Lauren screamed. The entire camp watched in stunned silence, witnessing how Lauren lashed out at Chanty. "Watch your mouth, Lauren," Vasper warned, his voice low, dangerous. But Lauren's fury only grew. "My cousin just died, and you're already wrapped in another man's arms? Already caged in someone else's embrace? You should be ashamed of yourself," she screamed, her glare darting between Chanty and Vasper. Vasper's eyes burned with fury as he stared at Lauren, unable to believe the sharpness of her tongue. Lauren turned on her heels and stormed out of the tent, barking orders at her personal assistant. She wanted to return to Sylvan Concord immediately. Chanty stood frozen in place. Her knees trembled. Her body shook, not just from rage but from humiliation. Around her, people and creatures alike stared at her, their eyes heavy with judgment. At that moment, Chanty felt like nothing more than a lowly, disgraceful woman. Was it right for Lauren to judge her because of what happened to Jake? Was Lauren's judgment of her fair? Vasper gently touched Chanty's arm. The guardians, especially Justin, looked at Chanty with deep sympathy, while Jacob clenched his fists as he stared at her. Gabriel and Louis, unable to bear what was happening, stepped out of the tent. Chanty bowed her head for a long time, silent, but tears continued to fall. David approached her. "Don't listen to what Lauren said. You know she only spoke out of jealousy, not because she cares about what happened to Jake. You've never gotten along from the start, and you know how much she wants Vasper. She's just using Jake's death to blame you," David said, glancing at Vasper. Vasper let out a bitter laugh and shook his head. Chanty wiped her tears. Vasper placed his hand on her waist, but Chanty pushed it away. The guardians, especially Jacob, were shocked at what they saw. Jacob's gaze on Vasper was sharp. Vasper was clearly hurt and affected by what Chanty did. "Babe. I'm sorry, please," Vasper pleaded, but Chanty remained silent. "David, I want to go to the Golden Bath. I'm exhausted. I need to rest," Chanty said, walking out of the tent without another word, without even saying goodbye to Vasper and David, who were standing right beside her. Mara quickly followed her, walking after her toward their vehicle. Vasper stood frozen, staring at his hand, the same one Chanty had just pushed away. David patted Vasper's shoulder. "Go home, Vasper. You have so much to take care of in your kingdom after your father's death. Don't worry about Chanty, there are 6 of us guarding her," David assured him before turning around and leaving the tent. Vasper remained, standing still, clutching the fabric of his father's robes. But Vasper refused to let things end like this between him and Chanty. He couldn't just let her walk away, not when she was treating him so differently now. And in an instant, Vasper disappeared. Inside Chanty's vehicle, she flinched when Vasper suddenly appeared before her, standing right in front of her seat. He looked down at her, his gaze piercing, while she sat still, staring back at him, seriously. Vasper shifted his gaze to Mara and gestured for her to leave the vehicle. Mara was about to step out when Chanty's voice stopped her. "No, Mara. Stay. Don't leave," Chanty said. Mara hesitated, then stepped back, standing in the farthest corner of the vehicle. "Vasper, go home to your kingdom. They're waiting for your report," Chanty said coldly. Vasper stared at her, unwavering. "I'll stay with you until you treat me the way you used to," Vasper declared. Chanty let out a deep sigh. "Vasper, please, just give me time to grieve for Jake. That's all I ask. Please understand me. My husband just died. I hope you can understand," Chanty pleaded. Vasper froze. Pain struck him so deeply that he felt like he couldn't breathe. He said nothing, just looked into Chanty's eyes. Chanty saw the pain in his gaze, and for a moment, she pitied him. But she forced herself to hold back. She needed time. She needed space. "Go home, change your clothes, and take care of your kingdom, Vasper," Chanty said softly, yet every word was crystal clear in Vasper's ears. Vasper was still jealous of a man who was already dead. But he couldn't help himself. Vasper exhaled heavily, then nodded. He took Chanty's hand, squeezed it, and pressed it to his lips. His warm breath caressed her skin, his lips soft against her palm. For a long moment, he just held her hand there, his lips unmoving. Chanty felt his warmth, his longing. Finally, he pulled away. "I love you. I'll come back when everything is over," Vasper said. Chanty said nothing. She only looked at him. And then, in a blink, Vasper was gone. Chanty took a deep breath, now that he was gone. But once again, tears fell from her eyes. Mara simply watched her, silent. The vehicle door opened, and elven staff entered, loading Chanty's suitcases inside. They were ready to return to Sylvan Concord. The 3 weeks following Alexander Mondragon's death passed like a blur in Chanty's life. Yet, despite the passage of time, she felt like a bird trapped inside a gilded cage, her freedom shackled, her every move dictated by an endless string of appointments. It was as though she bore the weight of an empire upon her shoulders, attending countless social gatherings where her presence was demanded, even beyond the borders of Sylvan Concord. Refusing was not an option, for each appearance came with a price that benefited Sylvan Concord. Since the moment she ended Alexander Mondragon's life, she had become somewhat of a hero in the inner world, particularly within Sylvan Concord. Everyone was eager to see her, to be in her company. Yet, these relentless engagements, crammed into just 3 weeks, had drained every ounce of her energy. What she truly longed for was to return to the outer world, to see her mansion, which was now nearing completion, and her vineyard. She silently thanked David, who regularly sent her photos of the mansion's progress, showing that it only needed a few finishing touches. He also kept her updated on the vineyard, sending documents for her to sign, along with pictures, especially of the newly constructed winery. Above all, Chanty took solace in knowing that Jake Valerian's death had been properly honored in Sylvan Concord. It was during the tribute that she met Jake's remaining family, but, more notably, she encountered Lauren's family as well. Jake had no surviving parents, no siblings, only Lauren, his sole cousin. Unlike Jake, Lauren was spoiled, selfish, and utterly insufferable. To Chanty's shock, Jake Valerian had left everything he owned to her. The sheer scale of his wealth in the inner world alone was staggering. His lands were vast enough to form a small nation. And that wasn't even counting his properties in the outer world, where he owned estates in nearly every major city and country. The sheer magnitude of responsibilities thrust upon her over these 3 weeks left Chanty overwhelmed. Her victories in Sylvan Concord demanded her constant presence, and with one event after another, she was expected to voice her opinions and contribute to the kingdom's prosperity. It felt as though she had been unwillingly thrust into political affairs, a life she never wanted, one that drained her spirit. But the harsh reality remained: she would be trapped in the inner world for another 2 years before she could return to the outer world. David had already gone back, taking charge of her winery, vineyard, and other businesses. However, with Jake Valerian's wealth now intertwined with hers, so too did her burdens multiply. While Marco and Justin had refused to stay in the inner world, Jacob had been tasked by David to serve as Chanty's assistant, ensuring she had support whenever she needed it. Thus, Jacob became her constant companion, accompanying her to the never-ending events within Sylvan Concord's kingdom. On this particular day, Chanty had just returned from an allied kingdom, where she had attended a royal wedding. The event weighed heavily on her heart, for it reminded her of her own wedding to Jake Valerian. The moment she entered her chambers, exhaustion washed over her. Without bothering to remove her sandals, she collapsed onto her massive bed. Her body sank into the mattress, arms sprawled out, eyes fixed on the golden ceiling above. She let out a deep sigh. If nothing else, she was grateful for the distractions that kept her mind occupied. At least, for a while, they helped her forget about Jake. But as she lay there, her thoughts drifted to the uncertain road ahead. What would happen next in her life? The coronation of Vasper Mondragon as the ruler of Velantis Noctem was fast approaching. From what she had heard, Vasper had sent Lyca Mondragon to Velantis, entrusting her with assisting in the kingdom's affairs, as he had yet to find someone he could truly rely on. Though Vasper and Lyca rarely saw eye to eye, he trusted her more than any of his other siblings. Chanty took another deep breath. What kind of path was she walking? Why did life place her in such an uncertain, precarious position? She had fallen in love with the son of her enemy. And soon, her days would be intertwined with Vasper Mondragon. Each night, Vasper would visit her dome, spend the night there, and then return to Velantis Noctem at dawn. This arrangement had been sanctioned by the king of Sylvan Concord, though Jacob strongly opposed it. Every time Jacob and Vasper crossed paths, their interactions were filled with tension, their hostility toward each other unmistakable. Vasper despised the fact that Jacob acted as Chanty's guardian and personal aide. To counter this, he had sent 2 female assistants to stay by her side. Jacob despised what Vasper had done, yet he was powerless to stop it, for Vasper was destined to be Chanty's husband. Still, Mara remained ever watchful over Chanty in the dome. Chanty finally rose from her deep thoughts, though her body felt heavy with exhaustion. She sat on the edge of the bed, slipping off her high heels. Carefully, she carried them to her shoe cabinet, placing them neatly in their designated spot before walking toward the large mirror. There, she slowly unzipped her dress, letting the fabric slide off her body. She needed a shower, to refresh herself, to cleanse the weight of the day, and to prepare for the countless events awaiting her tomorrow. She was already weary at the thought of facing another night among the royal families, the high-ranking nobles of Sylvan Concord, and the 13 Council of the Crowns at the upcoming dinner. As she stood before the mirror, completely bare, she exhaled deeply. Staring at her reflection, she whispered to herself, "Chanty, be strong. You can handle everything." A small realization dawned on her as she studied her own body in the mirror. There was a noticeable change in her figure, a transformation so striking that anyone who saw her would assume she was already in her 20s. She smiled faintly. Perhaps it was because her body had now fully matured, like a fruit ripened at the perfect time. Or perhaps it was due to the genetics she inherited from her mother, her curves, her flawlessly shaped breasts. She could rival women in their late 20s to early 30s. Then, suddenly, an unsettling thought struck her. Was she the only one aging? Would Vasper not age? Her eyes widened as she stared at her reflection. No way. If Vasper wasn't growing older, then what about her? Panic set in as she covered her mouth with her hand, stepping away from the mirror. What if she aged while Vasper remained forever young? Was it because of his bloodline? Did she? Would she age just as slowly? Or was she different? Her mind swirled with endless questions as she stepped into the shower, lost in thought. She didn't even notice when Vasper entered the room. With a smirk on his lips, he listened to the sound of the running water. Without hesitation, he peeled off his shirt and shorts, fully intending to join Chanty, despite already having taken a bath earlier. Chanty lathered soap onto her body when, in an instant, Vasper teleported right in front of her, completely bare, without a shred of clothing. Their eyes met, but his gaze was burning, filled with desire and longing, tracing every inch of Chanty's soap-slicked skin. A playful smirk curled on his lips before he grabbed her body and pulled her against him. "I love you," he whispered against her lips before capturing them in a deep, searing kiss, his hands roaming her body with reverence yet brimming with unrestrained hunger. His fingers found her breasts, kneading them gently, worshipping her curves, while Chanty hesitated, but she didn't stop him. She let him claim her lips, let him kiss her, though she did not respond. Vasper sensed it. He felt her resistance, even as she allowed him to continue. He moaned questioningly, pulling back slightly, his gaze searching hers. But Chanty remained silent, uncertain of how to voice her worries to him. Instead, she reached for the shower handle and turned it on, letting the cascading water rinse the soap off her body. The sudden rush of cool water drenched them both, but Vasper's grip on her only tightened as he trailed kisses down her neck, his lips traveling lower, past her collarbone, until they found her breasts. His tongue flicked over her sensitive skin, teasing her, drawing a sharp inhale from her lips. His hands slid lower, caressing the most intimate part of her with slow, torturous strokes. A shuddering moan escaped Chanty's lips, her breaths turning ragged under his relentless touch. When the last trace of soap had vanished from her skin, Vasper turned the shower off, but the heat between them had only intensified. Their bodies burned with need, their breaths mingling in desperate gasps. His hands roamed her curves possessively, his touch demanding, while Chanty surrendered herself completely, letting him do as he pleased. She could feel him, his arousal, hard and proud against her stomach. Her hands slid down, wrapping around him, stroking slowly yet firmly. A deep groan rumbled from Vasper's throat as he trembled under her touch. "I want you right now," he breathed, his voice hoarse with desire, his chest rising and falling with the effort to restrain himself. Chanty could feel it, the war within him. He was holding back for her. He had made a promise, waiting for their wedding night to claim her fully. But at that moment, as her body burned for him just as much as his did for her, she was ready to give herself to him completely. She wanted him to take her, to erase every distance between them, but shame held her back. She was a woman, how could she be the one to say it first? With effortless strength, Vasper lifted her, pinning her against the wall. Chanty gasped, her breath hitching as his mouth devoured her. Her fingers tangled in his hair, gripping it tightly, while his hands held her thighs apart, positioning her exactly where he wanted. His tongue played with her most sensitive spot, expertly teasing, tasting, and drinking in her essence as if she were the sweetest nectar. The pleasure surged through her veins, weakening her limbs, making her moans grow louder, more desperate. Her body quivered as waves of ecstasy washed over her. "Vasper, I can't take it anymore," she gasped, looking down at him through hazy eyes clouded with pleasure. Her voice trembled as she cried out, surrendering to the bliss that consumed her. Vasper looked up at her, his lips glistening, his eyes dark and intoxicated with lust. Slowly, he lowered her back down, but only until her waist aligned with his. Chanty straddled him, both of them gasping as the heat of their bodies pressed together. Even though he hadn't entered her yet, just the friction of their bare skin rubbing together sent shockwaves of pleasure through them both, igniting an uncontrollable fire. Their lips met again in a feverish kiss, raw and desperate. Chanty felt like she was being crushed against the wall, caged by Vasper's powerful arm as he held her tightly. His embrace was almost bruising, as if he wanted to mold her into his very soul, to become one with her. "Babe, I can't take it. Can I break my promise?" he whispered against her lips, his voice shaking, his entire body trembling. Chanty could only moan in response, but deep inside, her answer was clear, yes. She wanted him, needed him. There was nothing holding them back anymore. Ever since the death of Alexander Mondragon, there had been no barriers between them, no reason to wait. And yet, she had always wanted their first time to be on their wedding night. It was something they had agreed upon. But now she wasn't sure. The intensity of the moment, the fire raging between them, it was impossible to ignore. Vasper's mouth trailed lower, capturing one of her breasts, suckling it gently while his other hand caressed the other, worshipping her body with reverence. At the same time, he rubbed his hard length against her sensitive flesh, teasing her entrance without pushing inside. The sensation was overwhelming, sending Chanty into another spiral of pleasure. She gripped his hair tighter, arching against him, moaning louder, drowning in the storm of sensations he was unleashing upon her. Both of them were panting now, their moans mixing with the sound of the water droplets still dripping from their bodies. Their self-control was slipping, their restraint wearing thin. With a sudden motion, Vasper pressed her harder against the wall, his hands gripping her waist tightly. His eyes burned with raw desire as he stared at her, his body visibly trembling with restraint. The hunger in his gaze made him even more breathtaking, his blue eyes glazed with lust, his expression wild and desperate. He looked like a man starved, and Chanty was the only thing that could satisfy his hunger. She swallowed hard as she watched him position himself against her entrance, the thick head of his arousal pressing right at her core. Their eyes locked. Chanty's breath hitched, her body filled with both anticipation and a flicker of fear. "Vasper," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She was afraid of the pain, of the unknown sensation that awaited her. But her body was eager, trembling with need. Vasper, still shaking with restraint, slowly pushed just the tip inside. A deep groan escaped his lips, his entire body tense with pleasure. But for Chanty, the moment he entered her, a sharp sting shot through her, making her gasp. Instinctively, she pushed against his chest, halting him. "Wait," she cried out suddenly, her voice laced with both hesitation and alarm. Vasper froze immediately, his breathing ragged, beads of sweat dripping down his forehead. His eyes were wild, darkened with need, but at that moment, all he cared about was her. Even with his entire body burning for her, he stopped the moment she asked him to. His entire being trembled as he fought against his own desire, his hands gripping her thighs so tightly they almost left marks. Chanty looked up at him, her eyes wide, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Between them, his arousal throbbed painfully, glistening with her essence, aching for release. But he waited. Because she told him to. He paused to observe Chanty's reaction. Even in the midst of his overwhelming desire, he could still hold back for her. He didn't want her to suffer too much pain. "Vasper, you're too big. It's huge. That won't fit inside me with how big it is." Chanty protested, almost in tears, while Vasper chuckled in amusement. Watching her expressions, he couldn't quite describe how he felt, but he knew that hearing her say that only intensified his need for her. He pulled her close, then instantly teleported them onto the bed. Chanty lay on her back while Vasper knelt between her parted legs, smiling devilishly before lowering his mouth to kiss her intimately once more. It was as if he was asking, "Are you ready to take me in?" Chanty, watching him, felt her nerves tighten. She wanted to take back what she'd said earlier about being ready. She wasn't sure anymore. But then, her body betrayed her again. She gasped, her mouth falling open in a breathy moan as Vasper's tongue worked her over once more. Her head fell back against the pillows, fingers twisting into the sheets as Vasper spread her legs even wider, relentlessly worshipping her. Both of his hands massaged her breasts, coaxing her to let go. Chanty's breath hitched, her body arching towards him, seeking more. As her thighs trembled, Vasper moved up her body, his hand replacing his mouth as he continued his ministrations while their lips melded together in fervent kisses. "Are you ready?" Vasper murmured against her lips, his voice deep and sultry. Chanty moaned in response, unable to form words under his intoxicating kisses. She was already so warm, so prepared for him, but the nervous thudding in her chest remained. Still, her body ached for more. Vasper positioned himself at her entrance, his breathing heavy, his restraint hanging by a thread. "I can't take it anymore," he whispered, his voice trembling with urgency. But just as he was about to enter her, Chanty instinctively placed both hands against his chest, her legs pressing in around his waist. She could feel the heat radiating between them, the inevitable moment approaching, but her anxiety flared. When Vasper finally pushed inside, groans rumbled from his throat as his gaze locked onto Chanty's wide, shocked eyes. Her mouth parted as she gasped, her body tensing at the unfamiliar sensation. Even though he entered her slowly, carefully, she still felt the sting of pain, like a sharp blade slicing through her. She sucked in a breath, tears pooling in her eyes as she clenched around him. Vasper caught her lips in another deep kiss, his own body trembling as he fought to keep control. His voice was rough with restrained pleasure, his deep moans mingling with Chanty's soft cries. He withdrew slightly, then pushed in again, this time deeper. Chanty's whimper of protest turned into a muffled cry against his lips. "You're so tight, babe. It feels so good." Vasper groaned, his voice thick with desire. Chanty pressed against his chest, overwhelmed by the pain. It felt like she was burning, torn between agony and the slow-building pleasure. It was like she was trapped between heaven and hell, unsure which one would win. But with every passing moment, with each deep stroke, her body started to adjust. Vasper's arms tightened around her as if he never wanted to let go. "I love you, babe. I love you so much," he murmured, his voice raw with emotion. Vasper's breath came in ragged gasps, his movements deep and relentless, driving him further into the intoxicating heat of the moment. Chanty's moans spilled from her lips, a raw mix of pleasure and pain, her fingers curling into the sheets as wave after wave of sensation crashed over her. Tears clung to her lashes, her body trembling from the overwhelming intensity, but she didn't pull away. She couldn't. Vasper was lost, completely consumed by her. This was more than just physical pleasure, this was something sacred, something that set his soul on fire. He had never felt anything like this before. This kind of bliss, this pure ecstasy that came from being with the woman he truly loved. For so long, they had held back, restrained by limits and hesitation. But now, there was nothing standing between them. No boundaries. No resistance. Just them, lost in each other. His pace quickened, his breath warm against her skin as their bodies moved in perfect sync. Chanty's nails dug into his back, her soft cries mingling with his deep groans as they called out each other's names. The bed trembled beneath them, each movement sending it creaking in rhythm with their passion. Vasper captured her lips in a fevered kiss, swallowing her gasps, his touch possessive yet reverent. The pleasure that had once been edged with pain was now something else. Something breathtaking, something that sent heat pooling deep in her core. It was different. Unlike their stolen moments before, which had always stopped at the edge of temptation, this was raw, unfiltered, and completely consuming. As they climbed higher, reaching the brink together, their lips parted just enough to catch their breath. Eyes locked, filled with fire, Vasper held her tighter, pushing deeper, sending shivers down her spine. Chanty's body clenched around him, her moans turning into desperate cries, and in that final moment, he felt everything, her, the depth of her love, the way she surrendered herself to him completely. A deep groan tore from his throat as he reached his peak, his entire body tensing, heart pounding against hers. His release sent a shockwave through him, leaving him breathless, his forehead pressing against hers as the last tremors of pleasure faded. Panting, Vasper gazed at her, his eyes heavy with love and satisfaction. "I love you so much," he murmured, voice hoarse, thick with emotion. Chanty could barely keep her eyes open, her breaths coming in shallow pants, as though they had just conquered the highest peak together. She didn't have the strength to answer, but the way she looked at him, the way she melted beneath his touch, told him everything. A slow, teasing smile curled at his lips as he studied her flushed face. "See?" he whispered against her ear, amusement lacing his voice. "I told you it would be worth it." Chanty managed a small smile, but her body still trembled from the intensity of it all. It hurt," she admitted in a soft breath. "But it felt so good." Vasper's smirk deepened. "I know," he murmured, his voice low and filled with unspoken promises. Before she could say another word, his lips captured hers once more, pulling her into another slow, consuming kiss. And then, just as she thought she could catch her breath, he moved again. This time, slower, more deliberate, drawing out every sensation. Chanty gasped, gripping onto his shoulders, her body still sensitive, still reeling. She whimpered against his lips, her face scrunching slightly at the lingering ache. And Vasper pulled back just enough to look at her. "Don't worry," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Once the pain fades, all you'll feel is pleasure. Chanty's face burned with embarrassment, but before she could protest, he flipped her onto her side, pulling her flush against him. Her breath hitched as she felt his warmth press against her from behind. Before she could process the new position, spooning her, Vasper moved once more, and a deep moan escaped her lips, her body arching into his touch. His arms wrapped around her, one hand gripping her waist while the other roamed over her sensitive flesh, fingers teasing, exploring, igniting every nerve in her body. Her head fell back against his shoulder, her lips parting as pleasure overwhelmed her senses. The pain had all but vanished, replaced with something so intoxicating it made her entire body burn. Vasper groaned, his pace steady but deep, his lips grazing the curve of her neck. His fingers found hers, intertwining as he guided her movements. His touch a perfect balance of dominance and tenderness. Their rhythm grew desperate, their moans blending together, their bodies moving as one. Chanty gasped as the pleasure built again, spiraling into something uncontrollable, something earth-shattering. Just when she thought she couldn't take any more, Vasper's lips crashed onto hers once more, his pace quickening, pushing her closer, higher, until a sharp cry tore from her lips as she shattered, pleasure exploding in waves so intense it stole the air from her lungs. Vasper groaned against her mouth, his own release following right after, his body shaking as he held onto her, as though letting go would pull him away from the heaven they had just reached together. For a moment, neither of them moved, their bodies tangled, their hearts racing. The only sound in the room was their heavy breathing, the aftershocks of pleasure still rippling through them. Vasper's arms tightened around her, his lips brushing against her shoulder, her neck, her cheek, leaving slow, lingering kisses in his wake. "You okay?" he murmured softly. Chanty barely nodded, still dazed, still trying to catch her breath. Vasper smiled, his fingers tracing gentle patterns against her skin. "Does it still hurt?" he asked in a whisper. She hesitated before nodding slightly. Vasper chuckled, pressing a kiss to her forehead, then her lips. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "But don't worry, it'll go away soon." Chanty pouted at his teasing tone, lightly smacking his arm, but he only laughed, capturing her lips in another slow, passionate kiss. Even then, he still hadn't let go of her. His body refused to part from hers, as though he needed to stay connected, needed to hold on to this moment for as long as possible. Because this was different. Unlike anything he had ever experienced before, this wasn't just passion. This wasn't just physical. This was love. A love so consuming, so intense, that it made even heaven feel small in comparison. Vasper slowly pulled away, his movements deliberate and careful, his breath heavy with restraint. Chanty's eyes locked onto his, her lips parted as she gasped softly, the lingering ache making her body tremble. Her elbows pressed into the mattress for support as she looked down, watching as Vasper withdrew completely, revealing the undeniable evidence of what had just transpired. Their gazes shifted almost simultaneously. There, on him, was a deep crimson stain. Chanty's innocence, now claimed. And beneath her, on the golden sheets, more proof of the sacred moment they had just shared. Vasper's chest swelled with pride, his lips curling into a small, satisfied smile. He reached for the soft fabric of the bedsheet and gently wiped her, his touch filled with tenderness, reverence. He was careful, treating her as if she were the most fragile thing in the world, his every stroke laced with unspoken love. His eyes never left hers, brimming with adoration, admiration. She was his and his alone. Chanty gazed back at him, her heart swelling with emotion. This was real. The prophecy had come true. The past restraint of holding back had led to this, an undeniable, fated union. Her eyes flickered toward the grand, golden bed beneath them, and realization dawned upon her. This was the very vision she had seen before. But before she could dwell on it further, Vasper lowered himself once again, his lips brushing against her skin, trailing downward until they reached the tender, sensitive place between her thighs. Chanty shuddered, her breath hitching as she felt the warmth of his mouth against her, his lips pressing reverent kisses against her oversensitive flesh. He wasn't just kissing her. He was worshipping her, devouring her. A gasp tore from her lips as his tongue flicked over her, teasing, tasting, savoring. A torturous rhythm, slow and deliberate, filled with devotion. Chanty's back arched, her fingers twisting into the sheets, her breaths coming in shallow, shaky moans. Her mind spun. The pleasure was too much, too intense. Vasper's hands roamed over her body, his fingers finding the soft swell of her breasts, kneading them gently, yet firmly, as if urging her to surrender completely. She let out a desperate cry, her own hands flying up to grip his, her body trembling beneath his touch. But he didn't stop. His mouth worked her relentlessly, his tongue flicking and sucking, sending her higher and higher until she was gasping, writhing, her thighs tightening around him. Her hands tangled in his dark hair, clutching desperately as she felt the pleasure build, the tension coiling deep inside her. Vasper groaned against her, the vibrations sending another shockwave through her already sensitive body. "Vasper," she whimpered, her voice barely more than a breath. But he already knew. He could feel her unraveling, her body trembling, her legs tightening. He gripped her thighs and lifted them slightly, holding her open as he ravished her. Hungrily, greedily, drinking in every reaction, every sound she made. Chanty's body tensed, her toes curling, her breath catching as she tipped over the edge. Her release crashing through her like a tidal wave. A choked cry escaped her lips as pleasure consumed her, her body quivering beneath him. Vasper pressed one last kiss against her trembling core before lowering her back onto the mattress. Their eyes met, heavy with desire, satisfaction, and something deeper. Then, without hesitation, he moved over her once more, his lips capturing hers in a desperate, fervent kiss. "I can't get enough of you, babe," he murmured against her lips, his voice thick with longing. His hands roamed lower, teasing her sensitive flesh once more, drawing out soft whimpers from her lips. And when he pushed into her again, Chanty gasped, her body arching, her fingers digging into his shoulders. The pain was still there. Sharp, stretching, an unbearable fullness that made her tremble. "Vasper, it hurts," she whimpered, her face contorted with both pleasure and pain. Her eyes, glossy and pleading, only seemed to ignite something deeper within him. Instead of pulling back, Vasper pushed in deeper, a low groan escaping his throat. He kissed her fervently, swallowing her gasps, murmuring against her lips, "Don't worry, babe. It's only painful at first. It'll fade soon." Reaching for a pillow, he slid it beneath her lower back, angling her hips. And Chanty's eyes widened as another gasp left her lips. Vasper's face was utterly intoxicated, his breathing ragged, his expression lost in pleasure and longing. Chanty's thighs trembled, the ache deep within her almost unbearable, yet mixed with something far more consuming. Something that sent heat pooling in her core, despite the pain. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't push him away. She wanted this. She wanted him. She wanted more. Vasper gently lifted her legs, wrapping them around his waist, and Chanty followed, her body molding into his as he began to move again. Their moans blended together, their bodies moving in perfect sync. Chanty couldn't comprehend what she was feeling. Pain and pleasure clashed within her, an inferno and heaven all at once. Every thrust was deep, unrelenting, yet Vasper held back, controlled his pace, his body trembling as he fought against his own primal urges. He wanted her to feel everything. And she did. She felt him. Every inch, every stroke, every ounce of devotion he poured into her. Chanty gasped, her body arching, her nails dragging down his back as the pleasure built once more. Vasper groaned, his breath ragged as he buried himself deeper, his lips finding hers again in a searing kiss. The world faded around them. There was nothing else, only this. Only them. Vasper's pace quickened, his control slipping, his moans growing deeper as he felt himself nearing the edge. Chanty was right there with him, lost in the storm, drowning in the overwhelming pleasure. Vasper's groans filled the room, blending seamlessly with the breathless whisper of, "I love you," against Chanty's ear. His voice was hoarse, thick with longing, each word vibrating through her, igniting something deeper. "Come with me to heaven, babe," he murmured against her lips, his breath hot, tantalizing. Chanty couldn't even form a reply. The moment his next thrust came, it stole every word, every thought, leaving only pleasure. Relentless, intoxicating, all-consuming. Vasper moved without restraint now, his pace fast, deep, merciless, pulling her along into the abyss of sensation. Chanty's cries filled the space, her moans spilling from her lips unchecked. His body, hard and powerful, pressed against hers, trapping her beneath him, claiming her with every stroke. He was unyielding, and yet, his touch, his embrace, remained possessive, reverent. His arms locked around her, pulling her impossibly closer, his muscles flexing as he anchored himself against the headboard. His movements were machine-like. Fierce, unrelenting, desperate. The bed beneath them groaned, protesting under the force of their passion, its steady rhythm echoing through the dimly lit room. But neither of them cared. The only sounds that mattered were their moans, their gasps, the way his name spilled breathlessly from Chanty's lips like a prayer. Vasper captured her mouth again, devouring her lips, swallowing her cries as their bodies moved in perfect sync. Chanty clung to him, her fingers digging into his back, her own body tightening around him, pushing them both higher, closer to the inevitable peak. And then she felt it. The sudden, overwhelming rush of pleasure. The moment where everything coiled tight. Impossibly tight. Before shattering. Vasper groaned low in his throat, his body locking as he pulsed inside her, his release coming in deep, powerful waves. He drove into her one last time, sinking himself to the hilt, pressing impossibly close as if he never wanted to let go. There was no space left between them, no breath, no distance. Only the raw heat of their bodies, intertwined and trembling in the aftermath. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They remained frozen in place, their chests rising and falling in rapid succession. Their bodies still lost in the haze of pleasure. Vasper's arms remained wrapped around her, his grip impossibly tight, as if afraid she might slip away. Chanty's breathing was erratic, her body spent, her mind hazy. But the pain that had once lingered had now settled into something else. Something deeper. Something unforgettable. Vasper finally released Chanty's lips, loosening his embrace just enough to gaze at her. His eyes tracing from her tousled hair down to her swollen lips. His expression was reverent, worshipful, filled with love and deep satisfaction. The look on his face was unmistakable, the pleasure he had just experienced. The fulfillment of something he had long craved. "I love you so much," he whispered, his voice husky, low, raw with emotion. "At last, you are completely mine." A slow, triumphant smile stretched across his lips, making him even more breathtaking. His long, dark hair, usually tied in a man bun, had come undone, falling in messy waves around his face, only adding to his irresistible appeal. Beneath him, Chanty was still catching her breath, her body pinned under the weight of his own. "You belong to me, my queen." His voice was filled with possessiveness, with a joy so profound he could barely contain it. "You don't know how happy I am right now," he murmured, kissing her lips with deep, lingering passion before moving to her cheek, then her neck, worshipping her with every press of his lips. He kissed her over and over again, as if he couldn't get enough, before pulling back to meet her gaze once more. And then, realization dawned in Chanty's hazy, pleasure-drunk mind. "So this is the golden bed I saw in your memory, not the one in Alexander's chamber," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. A soft moan escaped her lips, her body too spent to say anything more. Vasper responded by kissing her again, deep, consuming, filled with unspoken promises. All my waiting, all my restraint. It was all worth it. And now, I have you, babe. I love you. His lips claimed hers once more, devouring her. But as Chanty's breath slowly steadied, she felt it. Vasper was still impossibly hard inside her. He hadn't softened, not even for a moment. Then, without warning, he started moving again. Slowly. Deliberately. She gasped, her body still aching, the soreness persisting with every measured thrust. Pain and pleasure intertwined, overwhelming her senses. Vasper ground against her skin, his lips trailing down her throat as he pushed deeper, savoring the way she clung to him, her body still adjusting, still sensitive. Then, just as suddenly, he pulled away, his length slipping free from her warmth. Chanty barely had time to process the loss before he grabbed her, flipping her over. Her breath hitched. This was different. She found herself on her hands and knees, her face buried in the pillow, her body trembling as Vasper knelt behind her. And then, he was inside her again. A sharp cry tore from Chanty's lips, muffled against the pillow. Her fingers clenched the bedsheet in a death grip. Her entire body shuddering at the depth, the rawness of it. Vasper's groans filled the air, his voice hoarse as he whispered her name like a prayer. Chanty bit the pillow, her moans turning into desperate cries. It was too much, too deep, too fast. Every thrust sent shockwaves through her. Pleasure and pain intertwining, leaving her utterly undone. Vasper held her hips, his grip firm, possessive, his pace ruthless. His control was slipping. He was lost in her, in the way she felt around him, in the way her body surrendered to him completely. His name was a broken whisper on her lips, her voice ragged, trembling. Faster. Harder. Deeper. The sound of their bodies colliding. The creaking of the bed. Their gasps and moans. All of it built into a symphony of unrestrained passion. And then, Chanty felt it. That familiar, all-consuming sensation coiling deep in her core, winding tighter and tighter, threatening to snap. Vasper threw his head back, his eyes clenched shut as he felt himself teetering on the edge. Chanty, he groaned, his voice rough, desperate. He gripped her hips tighter, angling her just right. And then, one final thrust. A sharp cry. And everything shattered. Their bodies tensed. Locked together as they both unraveled in unison, wave after wave of pleasure consuming them entirely. Vasper buried himself deep inside her, his release spilling into her in pulsing, shuddering waves. For a moment, there was only silence. Heavy breathing. Racing hearts. Chanty lay motionless, her body spent, her cheek pressed against the pillow as she gasped for air. Vasper remained still behind her, his arms wrapped around her, his body draped over hers, unwilling to let go just yet. Slowly, he withdrew, reaching for the sheet to gently clean them both. The evidence of their union was still there, but faint now. He moved carefully, mindful of her tenderness, his hands impossibly gentle. He should have let her rest. But he didn't. Instead, his lips found her skin once more, trailing over every inch of her, worshipping her. And it didn't stop at once. It happened again. And again. 3 times in total. Each time in a different position. And when they finally shattered together, their cries filled the room, their bodies locking. Hearts pounding in sync. Vasper collapsed against her. Breathless. His face buried in the crook of her neck, his body still trembling from the intensity of it all. Chanty could barely move, her body spent, her limbs still wrapped around him as if afraid to let go. Vasper brushed a damp strand of hair from her face, his fingers trailing over her flushed skin. His lips found hers once more. Soft, tender, reverent. "You're mine," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Possessive. Forever. Chanty smiled weakly, her heart swelling with love. Forever. She echoed, her voice barely above a breath. And as Vasper pulled her into his arms, pressing her close. Chanty lay utterly spent in his arms, her body exhausted, her limbs too sore to move. Even the simplest motion made her wince, her body tender, swollen, aching from the intensity of it all. She couldn't even walk to the bathroom. Vasper carried her. And he did it carefully, protectively, holding her close as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Even as he set her down gently, his lips found hers again, whispering between each lingering kiss, "I love you." It was endless, his devotion, his hunger for her. His body still craved more, but Chanty was too exhausted to continue. She needed time to breathe, to recover. "When you wake up, we'll go to the golden bath," Vasper murmured, brushing his fingers through her hair, his gaze locked onto hers. Chanty only moaned in response, her eyes barely open, sleep already pulling her under. Vasper chuckled, his touch feather-light as he traced her face. "So we can do it again," he added, smirking. Chanty laughed softly, her eyes closing. Vasper captured her lips in one final kiss, holding her close. He didn't let go immediately. He lingered, savoring her warmth, her scent, everything about her. Sleep now. She was already drifting. And Vasper? He didn't sleep. Instead, he watched her. He memorized her every feature, every breath, every inch of her bare skin glowing in the dim light. At last. She was his. Completely. Finally. He smiled, his heart impossibly full. "You don't know how happy I am right now, babe," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then, pressing one last kiss to her lips, he closed his eyes, content. And as sleep claimed him, only one thought remained. He wanted Chanty to have his child. For the first time in his life, he wanted a family. With her. And only her. A smirk tugged at his lips. And with that thought, he finally let sleep take him. Vasper's eyes snapped open. A jolt of awareness coursed through him, his senses sharpening instantly. Something felt different. Off. His gaze flickered to Chanty, who lay nestled against him, her breath soft and steady, her bare skin glowing beneath the dim light filtering into the room. She was deep in slumber, unaware of the turmoil stirring inside him. Slowly, carefully, he sat up, making sure not to wake her. His fingers flexed against the silk sheets as a realization struck him like a thunderbolt. We are in Sylvan Concord. And yet. His jaw tensed. How the hell did I use my power here? The memory surged through him, the way he had teleported, how he had moved seamlessly from the bathroom to the bed without even thinking. That shouldn't have been possible. No supernatural being had ever wielded their abilities within Sylvan Concord. The entire land was built upon a foundation of deep blue crystals, ancient, powerful stones that nullified any form of magic or special abilities. Not even the most formidable creatures had been able to bypass its restraints. And yet, he had. A slow, stunned exhale left his lips. Before he could think further, his body acted on impulse. In the blink of an eye, he vanished from the bed. A heartbeat later, he reappeared in the bathroom. His breath quickened. His pulse thundered in his ears. Another thought crossed his mind. Again. And just like that, he disappeared only to reappear by the window, the cold night air kissing his bare skin. He stood motionless for a moment, absorbing the rush of power coursing through his veins. Then, unable to contain himself, he teleported again, this time across the room, near the dresser. Then again. And again. Faster. Smoother. Stronger. With each blink, he moved seamlessly from one place to another, his mind spinning at the sheer impossibility of what he was doing. What does this mean? A soundless chuckle left his lips, his face alight with astonishment. He lifted a hand to his mouth, as if trying to ground himself in reality. He was practically defying the laws of this land. From the beginning, Sylvan Concord had been the one place immune to the powers of creatures like him. A sanctuary where no magic, no abilities, no supernatural force could function. Yet here he was, breaking the very foundation of its existence. His newfound strength exhilarated him, but deep within that excitement, a darker thought lingered. If I can do this, will others be able to as well? Would this revelation shake the balance of power? Would it bring unforeseen consequences? His expression hardened. There was no telling what this meant, but one thing was certain: he could no longer be bound by the limitations of this land. He had become something more. His gaze drifted toward the bed. Chanty lay undisturbed, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She was breathtaking, ethereal, a sleeping goddess barely wrapped in silk. His heart clenched at the sight of her, so blissfully unaware of everything that had just transpired. Had she even realized what he had done earlier? No. Their passion had consumed her entirely. She hadn't noticed when he teleported them onto the bed, hadn't even flinched. Vasper exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair. His eyes darkened as they roamed over her form. Then, his brows furrowed. A flicker of concern replaced his fascination. Carefully, he peeled back the blanket, his fingers tracing over the delicate skin of her thighs, her hips searching. And then he saw them. Bruises. Faint, but unmistakable. A sharp pang of guilt lanced through him. His grip had been too strong. His need too consuming. He had been reckless, lost in his own desire, and now he had marked her. A quiet curse escaped his lips. His fingers ghosted over the bruises, his chest tightening. Without hesitation, he lowered himself, pressing his lips gently against each mark. His mouth moved reverently, worshipping the evidence of his lack of restraint. "I'm sorry, babe," he whispered against her skin. She stirred slightly, but did not wake. Vasper clenched his jaw. She needed to rest. No matter how much he wanted her, how much his body burned for her, he couldn't be selfish. He sighed, pulling the blanket over her again, ensuring she was warm, cocooned in comfort. Then, with slow precision, he slipped beneath the covers, positioning himself beside her. For a long moment, he simply watched her. Studied the soft parting of her lips, the way her lashes kissed her cheeks, the faint rise and fall of her chest. She was his. The woman he had longed for. The woman he would fight for. The woman who would bear his name, his children, his legacy. A future with her was all he wanted. But he knew this was only the calm before the storm. Trials awaited them. His coronation as king of Velantis Noctem was looming. His enemies were lurking. If he wanted a peaceful life with Chanty, he had to be careful. Strategic. Every move had to be calculated, every step deliberate. Lost in his thoughts, he didn't notice Chanty stir once more, until she moved, instinctively wrapping herself around him. Vasper stiffened. Her arms looped around his torso. Her leg draped over his thigh. Her warmth sank into his skin, into his soul, setting him ablaze. A ragged breath left his lips. His body responded immediately, heat flaring through his veins, desire reigniting like a wildfire. Damn it! His pulse quickened. His restraint wavered. The need to have her, to claim her again, was overwhelming. But no. She needed rest. And he needed to leave before he lost himself completely. Swallowing hard, he leaned down, brushing one last kiss against her forehead. "I'll be back later, babe," he whispered. Then, in a blink, he vanished. Now, he was aboard his flying vehicle, soaring back toward his kingdom. And though he had left her side, the fire she ignited within him refused to fade. As soon as Vasper entered his grand chamber, he let out a slow breath, running a hand through his disheveled hair. His body still burned, his skin still tingled, his mind still fixated on Chanty, the way her body had molded against his, the way she had whispered his name in pure ecstasy. The heat inside him was unbearable. Without a second thought, he reached for the waistband of his shorts and slid them down, letting the fabric pull at his feet. Now clad only in his briefs, he stood still for a moment, inhaling deeply, hoping that the cold night air would douse the fire raging within him. But then he froze. His breath hitched, and his muscles tensed as his gaze landed on the enormous, regal bed in the center of the room. A woman lay sprawled across the luxurious silk sheets, completely bare. Her body was a masterpiece, every curve, every inch of her flawless skin bathed in the soft glow of the chandelier above. The contrast between her ivory hair, cascading over her shoulders like a river of moonlight, and the deep crimson silk beneath her made her look like an ethereal goddess, draped in the most seductive of illusions. Zalora. She was breathtaking, an embodiment of temptation, and she knew it. Their eyes met. Her lips parted slightly, and a knowing smile curled at the edges. Her bluish eyes gleamed with desire, admiration, and something darker, something insatiable. She had always worshipped Vasper's form, his perfect, chiseled physique that radiated power, danger, and raw masculinity. And now, here he was, half-naked, standing before her, a true king. Yet Vasper's face was unreadable. His jaw clenched, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides. He was a storm on the verge of unleashing its fury. Still, Zalora remained composed. She knew what she wanted. And she had never been one to accept rejection. Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Then, with deliberate slowness, Zalora shifted, stretching like a feline on the bed, her bare skin brushing against the sheets as she propped herself up on one elbow. "Vasper," she murmured, her voice honeyed with seduction. But he did not answer. Instead, he turned his head away, his gaze fixed on the bathroom door. "Zalora," his voice was low, controlled, but ice-cold. "Leave the key to my room on the table. And get out." The words cut through the air like a blade. Zalora's smirk faltered. Her eyes darkened, the rejection slicing through her ego like a dagger. But she refused to back down. Not again. As Vasper turned and strode toward the bathroom, she moved. Fast. Before he could shut the door, she was already there. She slammed her hands against the wooden frame, eyes blazing with defiance. Her breath was ragged, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The pain of being ignored, of being cast aside so easily, sent fury surging through her veins. "You won't do this to me again," she hissed. Vasper's jaw tightened, his body rigid as he faced her. Before he could react, she closed the distance between them. Then, her lips crashed against his. It was fierce, desperate, demanding. Her arms snaked around his neck, pressing her bare body against his sculpted frame. She wanted to remind him of what they once had, remind him of the fire they used to ignite in each other. For a moment, the world stood still. Then, Vasper's hands gripped her waist. For a fleeting second, Zalora thought he would surrender to her. But instead, he wrenched her off him. Hard. She gasped as he shoved her back, his grip no longer one of desire, but of restraint. They stood inches apart, their breathing heavy, their eyes locked in a battle of wills. Zalora's vision blurred with unshed tears. Her lips trembled as the first drop fell, then another, trailing down her flushed cheeks. "Why?" she choked out. Her voice was small, broken. "Why, Vasper?" she whispered again, her knees buckling beneath her as she collapsed onto the cold floor. "Why are you doing this to me?" She sat there, sobbing, her arms wrapping around herself as though trying to hold together the pieces of her shattered pride. Vasper let out a long, slow exhale. Without a word, he walked to the closet, yanked it open, and pulled out a silk bathrobe. He strode back to her and crouched down. Still silent. Gently, he lifted her from the floor and wrapped the robe around her trembling frame, securing the ties to ensure it wouldn't fall. His fingers were light, careful, as they wiped away her tears. "Go home." His voice was soft but firm, leaving no room for argument. Zalora's lip quivered as she stared up at him, looking like a lost child. But Vasper didn't wait for her reply. With one swift movement, he took her wrist. And in the blink of an eye, they vanished. Zalora's chamber. The moment her feet touched the ground, Zalora realized where she was. Her own room. The moment the reality sank in, a strangled sob escaped her lips. She clutched her chest, her nails digging into the fabric of the robe he had put on her. Then, without warning, she collapsed onto her bed. A scream ripped from her throat, muffled by the sheets as she buried her face into them. Her body shook violently, her sobs coming in ragged gasps. How could he do this to her? Again? How could Vasper Mondragon look at her as if she were nothing? Her cries filled the vast chamber, echoing through the lonely walls. And yet, even through her heartbreak, through the agony of rejection, her fists clenched. If she couldn't have him, no one else would. Not even Chanty. Shanta's eyes fluttered open, a sharp sensation stirring her from sleep. She needed to pee. Slowly, she pushed herself up from the bed, but as she moved, a strange awareness settled over her. Her gaze darted around the dimly lit room, searching. Vasper was gone. A frown creased her brow. Her eyes shifted toward the clock on the wall, 2:33 a.m. But as she turned to look out the window, the world outside was bathed in an eerie glow, neither night nor day. The darkness of the early hours wrestled with an unnatural light, casting the surroundings into an almost surreal twilight. Realizing her state, she pulled the blanket over her chest. She was completely bare. Her fingers instinctively reached toward the side table, where Vasper's t-shirt lay folded. But the moment she moved, pain lanced through her muscles. A sharp ache pulsed through her thighs, her core. Her lips parted as she gasped, wincing at the soreness that consumed her body. We overdid it. A flushed smile ghosted over her lips despite the pain. Memories of their fevered passion flooded her mind, the intensity of their reunion, the way Vasper had ravished her without restraint. He, on the other hand, seemed tireless, while she, utterly drained, had succumbed to exhaustion. Jasmine's words echoed in her mind. You won't be able to walk properly for a week, especially if he's, well, you know, huge. A deep blush crept up her cheeks. Damn it, Jasmine, you were right. Shaking her head, Chanty reached again for the shirt, determined to cover herself. But just as her fingers brushed the fabric, a sudden shift in the air. Before she could react, Vasper materialized right beside the bed. Their eyes locked. Her breath hitched. She had barely recovered from her shock when she noticed his gaze drop to her outstretched hand, lingering on the t-shirt she was about to grab. Without a word, Vasper reached for it instead, handing it to her with an amused smile playing on his lips. Chanty swallowed hard, feeling the heat of his stare. His damp tousled hair only added to his dangerously alluring presence, and his smirk sent shivers down her spine. Her lips, still swollen from his relentless kisses, tingled under his intense scrutiny. Vasper sat on the edge of the bed, watching as she slipped his oversized shirt over her head. His smile deepened, but there was something else in his gaze, something dark, possessive, hungry. I don't have anything else to wear, she muttered. I'll just use your shirt. I need to go to the bathroom. He chuckled lowly, eyes glinting with mischief as they flickered over her body. She knew that look. His restraint was hanging by a thread. Chanty shifted, preparing to stand, but the moment she moved, pain. A dull, deep ache between her thighs. She winced, biting her lower lip. Vasper's smirk faded, replaced by a look of concern. Before she could protest, he was already reaching for her, his hands firm but gentle as he lifted her into his arms with effortless strength. You should have let me, you were in pain, he murmured, teleporting them both in a blink. The next moment, they were in the bathroom. Chanty barely reacted. She had grown used to the way he moved, the way he ignored the normal constraints of space and time. Stay outside, Vasper, she said firmly, trying to sound unaffected. He didn't move. Instead, he stood there, staring at her with that infuriatingly knowing smile. She could already tell he was enjoying this, watching her struggle, watching her flustered reaction. But she was used to him now. Used to his teasing, his endless provocations. Vasper, she said again, this time with more insistence. Still, he didn't budge. A slow smirk curved his lips, eyes twinkling with amusement. But, mercifully, he relented, pressing a lingering kiss against her lips before vanishing from sight. Chanty exhaled in relief. But as she took her first step toward the toilet, pain shot through her once again. Her body protested the movement, her thighs trembling slightly. "My God. Jasmine, you were right. I can't walk," she murmured, gritting her teeth. She kept her voice low, unwilling to let Vasper hear her suffering. Little did she know. He had heard everything. A mixture of amusement and pride flickered across Vasper's face on the other side of the door. He bit back a chuckle, recalling Chanty's conversation with Jasmine about her fear of losing her virginity. And now, she was feeling the full effects of it. A smug sense of satisfaction settled in his chest. He was her first. Her only. But his amusement was overshadowed by something else, concern. After a while, when the sounds from inside the bathroom quieted, Vasper reappeared in an instant, teleporting back inside. Chanty, startled, turned to find him standing there, watching her. But his usual playful smirk was gone. Instead, his gaze was locked onto her thighs, her arms. The faint bruises. Their eyes met. Then, without a word, he scooped her up into his arms again, his hold firm yet careful. Guilt clouded his expression as he whispered, "I'm so sorry. I used more strength than I should have." His voice was barely audible, filled with regret. Before Chanty could respond, their surroundings changed. A golden glow surrounded them. Her breath hitched as she realized where they were, inside the grand dome of the golden bath. The entire place was deserted, the late hour ensuring their privacy. Vasper carried her to the edge of the pool, setting her down gently. Chanty, without hesitation, peeled off his t-shirt, preparing to step into the golden liquid. But Vasper caught the discarded fabric, his fingers tightening around it as his gaze darkened. His breath became shallow. His body tensed. Chanty stood before him, bare, her skin illuminated by the warm golden glow. His restraint snapped. Before she could enter the water, he pulled her against him, his lips crashing onto hers, fervent, desperate. Chanty gasped, caught off guard. His arms caged her in, his hands roaming, claiming, igniting her all over again. His hunger was undeniable, his kiss consuming. She felt his arousal press against her stomach, his deep groan vibrating through her as he ravaged her mouth. Her hands instinctively gripped his shoulders, but she barely had the strength to push him away. She moaned, not in protest, but in overwhelming sensation. Vasper growled, his lips trailing down her jaw, her neck, his hands desperate to feel every inch of her once more. A surge of panic mingled with pleasure. "Vasper," she managed, breathless. "We're in a public place, someone might see." That was enough to snap him back to reality. With a groan of frustration, he pulled away, his eyes still burning with desire. Chanty staggered back, gasping for air. She shot him a glare. Vasper simply smirked, utterly unapologetic. This was far from over. Meanwhile, Vasper chuckled as he looked at Chanty, who seemed utterly shocked. "I love you so much, babe," he whispered in a low, sultry voice. Chanty's lips parted slightly, her gaze locked onto him, still unable to process what he had just done. Her eyes flickered with disbelief, and Vasper, amused by her reaction, let out another quiet laugh. Was she more shocked by his kiss than by the teleportation he had performed in Sylvan Concord? The thought amused him even further. Without uttering another word, Chanty turned away and strode straight toward the golden bath. She descended into the shimmering liquid, letting its warmth envelop her body, seeking its healing embrace for the pain she had been feeling. Vasper watched her intently as she submerged herself, her body disappearing beneath the surface, leaving only her head visible. In less than 10 minutes, she would be fully healed. His eyes softened with unspoken affection as he knelt by the edge of the pool, watching over her. Their gazes met, an unspoken dialogue passing between them. If it were up to him, he would have joined her in the golden liquid, but the facility strictly prohibited men from entering the sacred bath reserved for women. They remained locked in each other's stare, lost in the moment, waiting for her body to recover. But then, suddenly, someone approached Vasper. Neither he nor Chanty had noticed the presence of another person within the facility, too engrossed in their heated exchange of looks. Lauren. Jake's cousin. She approached Vasper without an ounce of hesitation, completely naked, exuding confidence. She paid no mind to Chanty's presence as if she weren't even there. Lauren had seen everything, the way Chanty and Vasper had arrived at the pool through his teleportation, and it had shocked her. But what shattered her even more was witnessing what Vasper had done for Chanty. A searing pain spread through Lauren's chest, jealousy sinking its claws into her heart. The sight of them together, the way he kissed Chanty so intimately, she had longed for that moment with him for as long as she could remember. It was her deepest desire, to know how it felt to be held by Vasper, to experience the heat of his lips, the tightness of his embrace, to feel his body pressed against hers. But instead, she was forced to watch as he gave all of that to someone else. To Chanty, the woman she despised the most. Chanty's eyes blazed as she watched Lauren draw closer, her confidence unshaken. Vasper remained still, his stance unwavering, his gaze locked on Lauren with a stern expression. Chanty's heart pounded wildly as she tried to gauge his reaction. Would he acknowledge Lauren? Would he respond to her advances? But Vasper's eyes remained fixed on Lauren's face, never once straying to her bare body. Lauren's figure was nothing short of perfection. She had always been hailed as one of the most beautiful women in Sylvan Concord before Chanty arrived. And even now, she had suitors from the most powerful lineages, princes, noblemen, warriors. Yet, none of them mattered to her. Only Vasper Mondragon. She had preserved her purity, saved herself for him, devoted everything to winning his affection. Even if she had to settle for being his mistress, she would accept it, so long as she had him. Vasper, my king, she purred, her voice dripping with sweetness. I am so delighted to see you again. Would you like some tea? I can fetch it for you. Her lips curled into an alluring smile, one she reserved only for him. She lifted her chin, subtly flaunting her beauty, her flawless form, her greatest assets. But despite all her efforts, Vasper did not give her so much as a lingering glance, nor a smile, nor the reaction she so desperately sought. Chanty, watching from the golden bath, felt her throat tighten. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Was she jealous? Did she even have the right to be? She was to be Vasper Mondragon's wife. Everyone knew that. But Lauren refused to acknowledge that truth. No, thank you, Lauren, Vasper said flatly, his tone void of warmth. And just like that, he turned away from her, his expression shifting the moment he faced Chanty. A smile tugged at his lips, a stark contrast to his cold dismissal of Lauren. Lauren's entire body tensed, rage bubbling within her as she clenched her fists. Her hateful gaze landed on Chanty, the woman who had stolen her dreams, shattered her hopes, and taken what was supposed to be hers, Vasper Mondragon. But she was not done. With a sudden movement, she stepped closer to Vasper. The action caught him off guard. Chanty's eyes widened in horror as Lauren threw herself onto him, her arms snaking around his neck, her lips crashing against his in a desperate, fervent kiss. The contact lasted mere seconds before Vasper reacted. With swift force, he grabbed Lauren and shoved her away, his strength enough to send her stumbling backward. His eyes burned with anger as he glared at her. My king! Lauren gasped, tears welling in her eyes. I am willing to be your mistress. Anytime, anywhere, I will serve you. I want you. I love you. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she pleaded, her voice trembling with longing and desperation. Chanty, frozen in the bath, could barely breathe. She didn't understand the emotions overwhelming her. Was it rage? Pain? Heartbreak? The physical pain she had entered the golden bath to heal was gone, but in its place, a new ache spread deep within her chest. Seeing another woman kiss Vasper, regardless of whether he had wanted it or not, tore through her heart in a way she could not describe. But Vasper simply laughed. Not with amusement. With disdain. That will never happen, Lauren. Not now, not ever. Forget whatever feelings you have for me, he said, his voice steady but laced with warning. And do not ever do that again. My respect for you remains, but if you cross this line once more. He trailed off, the unspoken threat lingering in the air. Lauren stood frozen, shattered by his words. Her pride crumbled, her heart bled. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the man she had worshipped for so long. Without another glance at her, Vasper teleported to Chanty's side. His bluish eyes softened as he looked at her, concern filling his expression. Are you feeling better now? He asked, his voice gentle, his fingers brushing through her hair. Chanty could only stare at him, speechless. Slowly, she nodded. But her gaze drifted back to Lauren, who stood in the distance, eyes burning with both sorrow and rage. Hatred simmered beneath her trembling form as she watched Vasper's tenderness toward Chanty. Without warning, Vasper scooped Chanty into his arms, and in the blink of an eye, they vanished from the pool. Lauren remained standing, unmoving. Silent tears streaked her face, but her breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. The words Vasper had spoken echoed in her mind, piercing through her like a dagger. In that moment, she felt like the ugliest woman in the world. Worthless. Defeated. And yet, alongside her heartbreak, something else ignited within her, a burning hatred for Chanty. Her fists clenched as her body trembled. Unable to bear the weight of her emotions, she stormed toward another pool and submerged herself in the golden liquid. But no matter how deeply she sank, her tears did not stop falling. And Vasper's words would not stop haunting her.